A millennial walks into a bank. She has a master's degree, a six-figure job, three side hustles, and a negative checking account. The teller doesn't laugh. The teller nods, because the teller is also a millennial, and she hasn't eaten a hot meal since Tuesday. Welcome to the strangest economic paradox in modern history, a generation statistically richer than their parents were at the same age, who feel poorer than medieval peasants. On paper, they're winning. In reality, they're Venmo requesting $4.50 for shared guacamole at 11 p.m. Economists are baffled, boomers are furious, and millennials? Millennials are buying a $9 oat milk latte and calling it emotional infrastructure. Today, we're decoding the psychology of the poorest rich generation. 7 brain-bending money habits that aren't irresponsibility, they're survival algorithms running on a crashed operating system. Stick around for number 3. It'll explain every reckless purchase you've ever made. Every millennial was raised on the same bedtime story. Get good grades, go to college, get a job, buy a house. The end. It was less a life plan and more a cult recruitment pamphlet. Psychologists call this prospective identity conditioning, when a generation is told their future is prepaid if they just follow the script. Plot twist, the script was written in 1978. Nobody updated it. Millennials showed up to the promised job fair in 2009 holding a $120,000 degree, and the economy handed them a name tag that said, unpaid intern. Their brains didn't just get disappointed, they got cognitively betrayed. And a betrayed brain doesn't plan for 30 years from now, it plans for Friday. Here's a fun fact that will ruin your afternoon. The average millennial has lived through 4 once-in-a-lifetime economic events before age 40. .com crash, 2008 housing collapse, COVID economy, inflation but make it eternal. Neuroscientists have a term for growing up watching the adults in the room panic on repeat: chronic economic hypervigilance. Your nervous system literally rewires to treat money the way a war veteran treats loud noises. That's why millennials check their bank app 14 times a day. Not because they're obsessed with money, because their amygdala thinks the ATM is going to ambush them. Boomers saved because the future felt safe. Millennials don't save because the future feels like a prank. Here's where it gets weird. Millennials aren't just spending differently, they've rewired the definition of ownership itself. Why buy a car when Uber? Why buy a CD when Spotify? Why buy a house when the bank owns it for 30 years and you just live in its shadow like a medieval tenant? Psychologists call this post-ownership cognition, a mental shift where having is replaced with accessing. And once your brain accepts it, something eerie happens. Stuff stops feeling like wealth. A boomer sees a paid-off house and feels powerful. A millennial sees a paid-off house and thinks, cool, but can it be moved to Lisbon when I get laid off next Tuesday? It's not that millennials don't want to own things, it's that their brain has quietly unsubscribed from the concept. Every finance guru on earth has screamed the same sentence: if you just skipped the latte, you'd own a house. Let's do the actual math, because apparently nobody else will. A $7 latte every workday for 40 years equals roughly $72,000. The median U.S. home? $417,000. So unless the latte is also paying your property taxes, the math was never mathing. But here's the psychology bomb. Millennials know the latte won't save them. That's the whole point. They're not buying coffee. They're buying a microdose of agency in a world where the macrodoses were all sold out before they got in line. Behavioral economists call this compensatory microcontrol. When you can't control the big levers, housing, wages, healthcare, your brain obsessively optimizes the small ones. The latte isn't the problem. The latte is the only button that still works. Let's continue with calculated nihilism, the secret operating system. This is the one, the master key, the unified field theory of millennial money. Psychologists have coined a term that perfectly describes the millennial financial brain: calculated nihilism. It's not YOLO, it's not depression, it's a cold, mathematical conclusion. It goes like this: if the traditional finish line is statistically unreachable, then optimizing for it is irrational. Therefore, optimizing for present joy becomes the rational choice. Read that again. That's not reckless spending. That's a decision tree. When a 32-year-old drops $2,400 on a trip to Japan, instead of adding it to a down payment they'd need 14 more years to finish, they're not being financially illiterate. They've run the numbers and concluded that the memory has a better ROI than the math. And here's the part that destroys boomers. They're not wrong. In a system where wages rose 67% and home prices rose 320%, the classic advice isn't just outdated, it's misinformation wearing a suit. Now let's talk about the habit millennials whisper about in therapy: doom spending. Oxford actually added it to the dictionary in 2023, defined as spending money you don't have to soothe anxiety about a future you can't control. Here's what's happening in the brain. Chronic economic stress triggers cortisol overload. Your prefrontal cortex, the logical part, gets overwhelmed and taps out. The limbic system takes the wheel. And the limbic system has exactly one financial strategy: buy the thing, feel the thing, survive the day. So when a millennial impulse buys a $38 mushroom lamp at 1 a.m., that's not consumerism, that's neurological self-medication. Same reward pathway as gambling, same comfort loop as stress eating, just with free shipping. You can't out-discipline a nervous system that thinks it's being chased. And here's the final twist, the one that separates millennials from every generation before them. They know. They know the lattes won't bankrupt them and won't save them. They know the housing math is broken. They know their 401k is a suggestion, not a safety net. They know the system promised them a ladder and handed them a treadmill. Psychologists call this meta-aware consumption, when a consumer is fully conscious that their purchase is a coping mechanism and buys it anyway, because awareness alone doesn't pay the rent. It's the first generation in history to be simultaneously financially literate and financially doomed. They can explain compound interest. They can explain inflation-adjusted wages. They can explain why they can't afford a house while ordering DoorDash. That's not contradiction. That's adaptation with footnotes. So here's the truth boomers don't want to hear and gurus won't tell you. Millennials aren't bad with money. They're brilliant with a broken system. They didn't invent the rigged game. They just stopped pretending it was winnable and started playing a different one, where the prize is a weekend in Portugal, a tattoo, a golden retriever named Kevin, and the dignity of a $7 coffee. They're not the poorest generation, and they're not the richest. They're the first generation to do everything right and quietly realize that right was a trap.